Oh, well, hello, everyone. I was trying to recall when it was the last time when I was here at the ACE conference, and I think it was 6 or 7 years ago. And I think that already by that time, I was sharing my story about how self-organization and autonomy are those concepts that you should try at your companies at much broader scale than just self-organizing teams. And today I want to go back to this story, but using a different angle. I want to share a failure story, which is also a personal one because I'm with Lunar for 10 years already. So it's kind of my personal failure story as well. So Lunar Logic, by all accounts, is what I call a progressive organization. A progressive organization is this umbrella term that I would use to describe all sorts of different companies that are adopting progressive novel management methods. So think holacracy, think sociocracy, think teal. This would all be progressive organizations. And by all accounts, Lunar is a very radical progressive organization. Now, just to show how radical we are, in 2016, I tweeted that message that after 4 years of transformation from this kind of more classical model, it was done. The whole autonomy and whole authority was distributed to everyone at the company. At that point, our intern on the first day of their job could technically fire me. But from a perspective of time, I think that that message was naive, and having a second chance, I wouldn't publish it because it wasn't done. I don't think it will ever be done because first, there is a difference between authority, the formal power to make a decision, and autonomy, the actual use of that power. And while we did have distribute all the authority, I wouldn't expect that our interns would be firing me anytime soon, which means that they wouldn't be using that power, which means that they didn't have autonomy. And also what I realized after some more time was that it's not like to everyone because it's optional. I mean, no one is forced to be making all those difficult decisions. It's just that there is an option to do so. But I was still explaining how awesome this kind of organizational culture is. And to support that point, I was sharing this chart. And this chart shares like 3 different aspects that we try to measure at Lunar. So the blue line on this chart is our financial standing. So how well we are doing financially. The red curve is team stability or retention, how many people we are able to keep at the company. And the green line is perceived engagement. So it's not like how I feel engaged at work, but how I perceive my colleagues to be engaged. So as on every positive rosy chart, all curves go up and to the right, which is nice, right? And if someone asked me back then, it was 2019, I think, when I first shared that, what would be my predictions? What would happen in the future? I would probably say something like this. I would say that our financial results would be going better and better over time. I would say that our team stability that was at that time at exceptional over 90% retention would stay so. And I would expect perceived engagement to go slowly up. Now, I have a comfort that I can validate that hypothesis. Now, what did happen? Well, first of all, it seems that when it comes to the finances, I was a conservative because we were doing way better than I would hope for. And that's actually end of good news. When it comes to team retention, it went down. It went down from over 90% to around 80%. But the important thing here is not seen on this chart, because it's not only how many people have left the company, but also who actually have left the company. Around a year ago, we had an outflow of some of our most experienced people from the team. So that chart doesn't justify how hard it was to be there at the company around a year ago. But this one does. Perceived engagement fell flat on its face. Instead of being sustained or go slowly up, it basically went back to what we saw before the transformation, almost to what we saw before the transformation. And if that wasn't enough, I started gathering one more bit of data, which was atmosphere at the company. So I don't have the data for the full period, but basically for those 2 or 3 years, it shadowed the perceived engagement. So over the course of 2 years, we went from the situation when it was like, yippee, it's awesome to work at Lunar, we are doing so many great things, to, well, what am I doing here? And why haven't I changed the job already? So a good question to ask would be, what the hell has happened here? Well, actually, when I think about it, I think a much better question would be to ask, what the hell has happened there? And to answer that question, I want to summon Stephen Bungay. In his book, The Art of Action, he proposes this thinking model, where he plots alignment and autonomy as 2 dimensions of a single space, and each organization is somewhere in that space. So first of all, we would see organizations that are low on autonomy and low on alignment, and those would be organizations where we see a lot of inaction and a lot of confusion because people don't know what to do and they don't feel empowered to do anything, so that's it. Then we would have organizations where we see a lot of alignment, but still autonomy is very limited. And those would be companies where there is a clarity about where we are heading, what we are trying to achieve, but people wouldn't feel empowered to do something about that, so we would see a lot of micromanagement. Then we have companies where there is a lot of autonomy but little alignment, and in those companies we would see a lot of action, but those actions would be misdirected. It would be all over the place. People would be pulling toward different directions, and as a result, the company wouldn't be progressing towards its goals at a high pace. And finally, we have the sweet spot where we would like our company to be, which is where we see a lot of effective targeted action, and that's where we have both high alignment and high autonomy. But Stephen Bungay doesn't stop at this. He also shows the right path to reach this Garden of Eden, and it is through first reaching the high alignment and only then increasing autonomy. Now, I can confirm that this is a really damn good idea because we did completely opposite, and it triggered a lot of problems. So if I try to plot how autonomy and how alignment looked like over those years, I would do something like this. Like one disclaimer: all the dashed lines on this chart are totally made up. They are not based on data, so they are more like my interpretation of what I saw at Lunar rather than something that I measured. So over the years, autonomy was steadily growing at the company, and somewhere in the middle we had this point where for some time I thought we were done. We're obviously not, because beyond that point we still were seeing more people making decisions, more people making more decisions, more people making more serious decisions, more people making more serious decisions more often. So autonomy was still growing. How about alignment then? Well, about alignment, there is a story behind. So when I joined Lunar, it was going through temporary financial troubles. So it was kind of an easy for a caretaker of the company to set this kind of interim goal of reaching the point of financial stability. Long story short, we reached that point after around a year and a half. And then an insane CEO would set another, probably more aspirational goal, strategic goal, which we would try to achieve. The problem is, though, Lunar is not blessed with a sane CEO because I refused to do so. For some time, I hoped that some sort of collective aspiration, collective sentiment would emerge. Obviously, it didn't, so we just wasted some time. And then I tried to kind of coordinate, moderate that effort. Now, let me say this. Trying to figure out the company's strategy collectively was by far the most difficult thing I tried at Lunar, probably over my whole career ever. Just to explain that we are not yet there after all those years. So what we see here is this growing gap between high autonomy and limited alignment. Now, is that a problem? Well, to explain that this is actually a problem, let me use this metaphor. So imagine that circle as a company and arrows in that circle as individuals within that company. So how you would expect an organization to set its identity, what it is, what it does, for whom, what's its strategy, and so on and so forth. In a traditional hierarchical company, you'd basically find a person in power, be it a CEO or a managing director or a board of directors. You would ask those people what the identity of that company should be, and well, that would be it. Now, obviously, what you would realize that there are some people in that organization who are not really aligned with that aspiration, with that identity, and they would either realign themselves or more likely leave the company. And if the HR department of that company is doing any sensible job, they would probably rehire or hire people who are more aligned with that identity, with that vision. And thus, the momentum of the whole company would increase. It would be progressing faster toward its desired goals. What we did instead was this. We started with increasing autonomy. We started telling people, you have more influence over Lunar, over all sorts of aspects of Lunar, including thinking of what Lunar as a company should be. And only then we started asking them, hey, how do you think what the company identity should be? And not a surprise, we heard a lot of ideas all over the place. It's also not a surprise that a single organization cannot be all those things, right? We have to agree on something. But then, because people already were hoping that the company would be something that they desired, they started saying things like, oh, that's not what I hoped. That's not what I want to do. And if disappointment or frustration is the gap between expectations and reality, well, this is basically a recipe for a disaster, which indeed came in a very timely manner, as you can see. And I wish it were the whole story, but it isn't. So let me pick from a slightly different point. I want to talk about self-organization and autonomy. So probably every single person in this room has their own personal story, how you stumble upon the concept of self-organization. Here is mine, and I don't expect anyone shares it exactly with the same details, but it shows a point. So I stumbled upon self-organization, obviously, from Agile community, and I quickly realized that self-organization is nothing else than just implementation on kind of practice level of a broader concept of autonomy. And then from my experiences at Lunar Logic and also earlier ones, I realized how autonomy and transparency are intertwined. You cannot give people autonomy without giving them transparency, because they would be making uninformed decisions or stupid decisions. But also vice versa. You cannot give people transparency without any sense of influence over reality around them, because they would see what's happening around them. They would realize that they cannot change that reality, and they would end up frustrated. So those two are interconnected. And then from Dan Pink, I learned that autonomy is actually one of prerequisites for any environment that aspires to provide motivation and engagement to people. And oh, by the way, there are the other two, which is mastery and purpose. And then from Stephen Bungay, who I already mentioned, I learned that autonomy is dependent on alignment. And then alignment is nothing else than implementation of a more broader concept that we know from Dan Pink, that of common purpose. And then from a completely different train of thought, and probably coming from the most influential person from this presentation, at least when it comes to me, from Professor Anita Woolley, I learned the role of collective intelligence in creating effective teams, and how collective intelligence is dependent, to a point, that's important, to a point, on diversity. And oh, by the way, from Amy Edmondson, I learned how diversity is dependent on psychological safety, and then trying to connect different dots from different areas of my interest, I learned how the idea of explicit constraints that I know from Kanban method and from Lean community is also applicable to autonomy, because autonomy, if not constrained, it would petrify us. We would be too scared to do anything. And when we are at Lean, from Lean Core, from Edwards Deming work, we know that respect for people is important when we expect a diverse team. And from my conversations with Jay Bloom, who I believe at one point was a keynote speaker at ACE, I learned how autonomy is also dependent on responsibility or accountability, or how Jay would put it, on agency or care. Because if I don't care about the outcomes of the decisions that I'm making, it's just anarchy, not autonomy. And then from David Marquette, I learned that technical excellence is also a prerequisite to distribute autonomy, and technical excellence is nothing else than just implementation of a broader concept that we know from Dan Ping, that of mastery. And then from our work at Lunar Logic and our issues at Lunar Logic, which some of them I already shared, I learned how alignment is also a prerequisite for building a diverse team. And when we are at diversity, the other part of diversity is inclusion. And we also learned the hard way that inclusion is also important if you want to build a diverse team. And by that point, your mind is just about to blow, because you wanted just a little bit more of self-organization, didn't you? And you end up with that monster. And you change one thing, and 3 other things break. And then you fix them, and 5 other things are pulled apart. And it's just difficult. And then you realize that, oh, you screwed up at least at 2 of those. And then you realize that this is basically a house of cards. And you just remove 2 of them. And I already shared our failure story about lack of alignment. There's another one which we don't have time for today about inclusion. So we literally didn't have 2 cards. And interestingly enough, our house of cards was still standing. And then the pandemic hit. So what we did when the COVID pandemic started was probably what most companies in our niche did, which was we basically switched to remote work. We closed down our office. And suddenly, from a company where a lot of communication was happening in kind of face-to-face manner, we switched to messages on Slack. And there's a big difference. Because when you talk to someone, you see their emotions, their body language, their face expression, and most likely you're speaking in your native language, and suddenly we're down to messages on Slack. We don't see all of those. Many of those messages are in English, which is not a native language for many of us. And it's so much easier to look at that message through your own lenses, through your own biases, through your own prejudice, especially when you are talking with someone who you already have a relationship with that is a little bit strained, or there is some sort of a tension. So you look through your lenses, through your biases and prejudice, and your answer is probably more aggressive, less understanding than it might have been. And the other person does exactly the same. So you build tension on the top of tension, on the top of tension, on the top of tension, up to a point where those relationships become more and more difficult. But not only that. When we were together at the office, even with those people who we had problems with, every now and then we would meet them at the kitchen, fetching ourselves coffee or eating lunch together. And we would chat about something neutral, about vacation plans, or the last movie that they've seen, or the book that they are reading, or even the friggin' weather. And we couldn't help but see a decent human being in the other person. And that would kind of neutralize the relationship. It would bring it back to this neutral state where at least some of the tensions would go away. And suddenly we were deprived of that because, well, remote work. But not only that. Because of the pandemic and the lockdown, keeping yourself mentally healthy was more difficult. And some of us obviously were going through worse time. And what do you do when you go through the worst time when it comes to mental health? You obviously cut down the most challenging interactions. So interactions with those people who you already built all those tensions with. But not only that. If you were living in Poland a year and a half ago, you probably know what was happening. We were going through extremely difficult social issues, like generally in the country, up to a point where it was impossible to pretend that this is not happening. So obviously that part of our lives was brought to our work. And because we managed to build a very diverse team, obviously there were people having different opinions about those matters. And it all spilled. And then what happens when you face such difficult conflict? Well, you basically seek people who would support you. So you go to your support groups who could help you to stay sane. But it just so happens that those support groups are also echo chambers, are also people who think similarly to yourself. They wouldn't challenge you. So suddenly we brought those conflicts, those person-to-person conflicts, to a tribal conflict. There were groups thinking about other groups' things, not validating them because we didn't have a platform to communicate anymore. So no wonder it all went south. Now, Daniel Coyle, in his book, The Culture Code, defines 3 aspects of a strong organizational culture. And these are building safety, sharing vulnerability, and establishing purpose. And I already shared how we failed at establishing common purpose. But because of the pandemic, because of the lockdown, we also lost the safety part. Because suddenly we lost the sense of togetherness. We lost bonds of belonging because we lost signals of connection that we naturally got before the lockdown. So if I try to plot sense of belonging on our chart, it would probably look like this. So over the years, we were building this sense of togetherness, what it means to be the part of Lunar. And when the lockdown started, it all crashed. So basically, what lockdown did to us was it starved us from those belonging clues, and through that, heavily weakened our culture. And where frustration meets lack of belonging, you literally cannot expect anything good to happen. So to sum it up somehow, the question to ask may be, so hey, Paweł, does it mean that this self-organization and autonomy that you are talking about is maybe, just maybe, a concept that is applicable only in this team-level context, the way it all started 25 years ago? Well, I have a few answers to that. Some of them are not very optimistic. The first one is this. First of all, we already established that this is complex. This is difficult. And because this is difficult, I wouldn't expect our industry in general to do a serious job with that. I mean, we are the industry that does Scrum by the book and calls it agile, right? So I wouldn't expect us to do a especially good job trying to think it through and implementing all those bits and pieces that create an exceptional organizational culture. And the other part of that message is that despite what some management thought leaders would likely tell you, I don't think that management revolution is around. I mean, namely, I'm referring to Frederic Laloux, who tells that teal is the next management revolution. I don't think, because this is difficult. As a matter of fact, there are companies that would work according to those principles for 40 or 50 years. There are paragons of autonomy-based organizational culture. And yet, it doesn't become something that's seen everywhere in the job market. There are very few companies that are still trying that, despite how long we see success stories of such organizations. But to move to some more optimistic messages, JFK famously said that the US didn't go to the moon because it was easy, but precisely because it was hard. And that's a good thing, because this thing is hard. Distributing autonomy and making truly self-organized groups is difficult, but it also means that it's difficult to copy. It is difficult to emulate. So if you pay attention and if you do your homework and create an organization or a team or a division that works according to those principles, you have a competitive advantage. A competitive advantage that is not easy to copy, not easy to emulate, not easy to steal. And there is a message also to those who would tell me, but hey, Paweł, you are in a privileged position because you lead a company, so you can organize it the way you want. And I'm only a team leader or a director or whatever, mid-level manager. The same way as companies compete with each other for business, the same way our teams compete with each other for talent. And then that kind of an organization means that you have a competitive advantage on a job market. And I can tell you that people who are leaving Lunar, they remember that culture with a huge sentiment. And they are not willing to go to just any organizational culture because their expectations are already changed. So if you build that kind of a culture, you have also competitive advantage on a job market, either within your company or in more broader terms. And just a short postscriptum to the presentation. We have a year more of data, and we bounced back. The atmosphere and perceived engagement is already climbing up to the levels that we've seen a few years back. Financially, we didn't really take a scratch. And while team stability went down, I don't really worry about that, because out of those, this is the most lagging indicator. Because if I'm frustrated today, I'm leaving the company tomorrow. So I expect the red line to bounce up again the next year. And feel free to challenge me at that. Thank you very much.